Just before we get started with today's video, I do want to say that it's brought to you by me, or rather by another channel that I do called Business Plays. It's about business, but it's interesting. It looks at the most epic failures and times that things went wrong, but also little-known successes. Generally just the weirdest stuff that I could find from the business world, like why the £50 note in the UK is kind of for criminals. It's more laid back than this channel. It throws a good amount of silliness and fun at you, along with some facts. Check it out through the link below and let's get into today's video. And today we are answering an audience question because Ian K asks us, why are taxes due on April the 15th? I assume in the US. If I filed on April the 15th, I'll get in trouble because it'd be quite late. As Ben Franklin wrote in a 1789 letter to Baptiste Leroy, in this world nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. Depending on your belief in vampires, this is most certainly true. But did you know that income taxes in the United States didn't exist until 1861? In fact, it wasn't until 1913 when income tax became the official law of the land. The first document that governed the United States was not the Constitution, but rather the Articles of Confederation. The AOC asked each state to enter into a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare. What it didn't do was give Congress or the federal government the power to tax. The framers of the AOC feared any centralized government, a direct result of being subjects of the British Empire, where they were forced to pay taxes with little to no representation in Britain's government. I think that was why there was that whole rebellion thing. After all, no taxation without representation became a rallying cry used by many, including George Washington, when he presented the policy in 1769 by bringing a series of resolutions before the Virginia House of Burgesses. Needless to say, the newly formed country was pretty sensitive to taxation in general and a powerful centralized government. The AOC left the states to determine their own taxes, but in turn this obviously left the new government without any money, and they were essentially just broke. This was not a good way to start out. Even the citizens of the new country seemed to agree that this was a bit of a poor course of action. In May 1787, the Philadelphia Convention was assembled for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. The new Constitution, officially adopted, laid out Congress's role in collecting taxes in Article 1, Section 8. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. In Section 9, it further reads, "No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken." So Congress now had the ability to tax items, but for all intents and purposes, it could not issue a direct tax. While an improvement on the Articles of Confederation, it still left a considerable gap in the government's ability to levy and collect taxes. Additionally, what items Congress taxed didn't always sit well with the populace. In 1794, Pennsylvania farmers, angered by tariffs put upon whiskey, came after tax collectors. They tarred, feathered, and burned down their houses. Anyway, this whole thing became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Property taxes, excise taxes, and stiffer duties were all enacted in America at the turn of the 19th century, but it wasn't until the Civil War when income tax entered the public lexicon. In order to help finance a war that turned out to be, at that time, the most expensive in the nation's history, the Revenue Act of 1861 was enacted. Signed into law by President Lincoln, it imposed a tax of 3% on individual incomes over $800 annually, thus becoming the nation's first flat tax. Immediately, there were problems. First off, there was no enforcement mechanism, as in if individuals didn't pay, well, what was going to happen? Second of all, only a relatively small percentage of the country's population earned that much in a year, so in a nutshell, this amounted to not nearly enough to support the war effort. In 1862, this act was repealed and replaced with the Revenue Act of 1862, which established the Commission for Internal Revenue, the precursor to the IRS, and progressive tax. This hiked the tax rate on those who made more. This got closer to the intended goals of the original act and actually did help fund the Civil War, though the Revenue Act of 1864 further raised the needed funds. In 1872, in the post-war environment, all the tax acts were repealed. Direct taxes, or flat tax, didn't crop up as a major issue again until 1894 with the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act. Wilson-Gorman, named after the senators who introduced it, called for a 2% flat tax on income over $4,000, which accounted for less than 10% of the US population. A year later, though, the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. It wouldn't be until 1913 and the 16th Amendment when this issue was brought up again in a public forum. The 16th Amendment reads, "Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration." And thus, the modern tax system was born. Much like the previous incarnations, it at first only imposed taxes on the wealthy, those making over $3,000 annually. As for the tax due date, we're finally getting there. Since the 16th Amendment was ratified on February 3rd, 1913, they gave the affected a year to get their finances in order. Well, a year and a month. The first official tax day was March 1st, 1914. 4 years later, income taxes were raised to expand the base of people paying from 1% of the population to 5% and raise the amount due. They also moved the date to March 15th to partially accommodate the extra workload on those processing the taxes. By 1945, over 45 million Americans were paying income taxes, and the due date was still March 15th. 1955 brought a few relatively minor tax codes, but a major change to tax day. It was moved to a month later, April 15th, where it still sits today, over half a century later. The IRS's official reason for why they made the change was to spread out the workload for its employees and give them more time to process the returns that year. More specifically, some of those tax code changes came with extra complications in processing the tax returns and a greater number of deductions and credits to sort through at a time when everything was done by hand and on paper. Thus, the hope was that the peak workload time would be spread out a bit more by extending things a month, though in truth that seems to be putting an awful lot of faith in people not procrastinating to the last minute regardless of the date. But to be fair, people expecting a return would likely be incentivized to file earlier, so presumably it worked a little bit. Of course, others have a different idea as to the reason. As law professor Ed McCaffery of the University of California speculates, the real reason was that, to quote him, pushing the deadline back gives the government more time to hold on to the money. As to his source of this claim, he doesn't give any, so he's essentially just guessing. Bonus facts. While it's mostly recognized as being a punishment handed down in colonial times, the history of tarring and feathering stretches all the way back to the Crusades and possibly further, with the earliest known recorded reference to the punishment being an edict passed down by Richard the Lionheart in 1189. According to King Richard's decree, if one of his soldiers was found stealing from his fellow crusaders, he was to be shaved and then coated in boiling pitch before having a cushion of feathers poured over his head. The thief would then be left stranded in whichever country they happened to anchor in next. Brutal. While the explicit wording King Richard used suggests that the punishment wasn't meant to be fatal, it's not difficult to see how pouring hot pitch over someone could easily prove deadly, especially at a time before there were any antibiotics to treat the inevitable infections from such severe burns. The most common injuries from the tarring and feathering itself were indeed burns and blisters. After the individual was then thoroughly humiliated, perhaps by parading them around town in a nude or semi-nude state, he or she also tended to find it difficult to get the tar and feathers off without potentially losing a little skin in the process. This left behind a lasting testament to their shame in the form of scars. Because tarring and feathering was a punishment most often handed down by angry mobs, which aren't exactly known for their restraint, individuals subjected to the punishment were also sometimes severely beaten. For example, in 1832, a Mormon minister named Sidney Rigdon and his friend, none other than Joseph Smith himself, were almost killed when a mob dragged them from their homes in the dead of night, severely beat them while trying to force-feed them acid before tarring and feathering them and leaving them both for dead. Amazingly, both men were able to survive this horrifying ordeal. Unfortunately, Smith's baby, who was left exposed to the elements during the event, was not so lucky, dying shortly after. From all this, you might be surprised to learn that most people who were tarred and feathered actually survived the ordeal. How? Well, in most cases, the tarring and feathering were simply meant to humiliate the individual in question and not actually kill them. As such, pine tar was commonly used, which has a relatively low melting point, typically around 130 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 55 to 60 degrees C. Certainly hot enough to cause an exceptional amount of discomfort and burns, but nothing like the harm that would be caused by various forms of melted petroleum-based tar. Further, depending on the perceived crime or slight against the masses, the pine tar may not, in some cases, be melted and then poured on, but simply heated a little and then roughly rubbed on the individual to leave enough residue on their skin for the feathers to stick. Painful? Yes, absolutely, but it might avoid some of the horrible burns. So, if the goal was to cause excruciating pain and death, boiling pitch or coal tar could be used along with severe beatings. But given the very good survival rates we have record of, it would appear this was rarely what those administering the tar and feathers were going for. Survivable pain and humiliation was the name of the game in most cases here. If the mob wanted to kill the person, they had more expedient and less elaborate methods for doing that, such as hanging. And now for another bonus fact. Speaking of death and taxes, although often given credit for this and many other such phrases that he didn't actually coin, Ben Franklin wasn't the first to note the certainty of death and taxes. For example, among the earliest in 1726, Daniel Defoe noted in his The Political History of the Devil, things as certain as death and taxes can be more firmly believed. And a decade before, in Christopher Bullock's The Cobbler of Preston, he states, "'Tis impossible to be sure of anything but death and taxes." And now for another bonus fact. Even a nuclear war won't get you out of paying your taxes or keep the Internal Revenue Service from coming after you. Since the 1960s, the US Treasury Department has had an Internal Revenue Manual guiding the IRS employees on how to function in the event of wars, natural disasters, pandemic influenza, terrorist attacks, and yes, nuclear explosions. According to the manual, the agency would expect to resume assessing and collecting taxes within 30 days of the attack or emergency. Several proposals of guidelines are in place depending on the situation that include cash grants to survivors, the government paying off outstanding bank loans and mortgages, the government buying assets destroyed in the attack, and abandoning the existing tax policies for new ones that will fund the rebuilding process. It's going to be a pretty major change there. And now for another bonus fact. An interesting thing to note about vampires is if each vampire ate just one meal per day, starting with just one vampire, with each victim then turning into a vampire, it would take only about a month for the entire human population to become vampires. We can only presume from this that our vampire overlords have very strict laws in place about making new vampires. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, smash that like button below. Also, don't forget to check out my new channel, Business Blaze, which I will link to below. Thank you for watching.